Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to give it a few minutes to let some people trickle in. I know that the proverbial metaphorical digital doors swings open and closed at different speeds for everybody. But I will just mention from the get-go that we're definitely going to leave some time for Q&A at the end. We have a chat box and a Q&A box. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A field, and we will definitely get to those at the end. So I'm just going to give it again maybe one more minute to let people get seated and situated. Today we're going to be talking about the German Due Diligence Act, the Lieferkettengesetz, and this is a webinar put on by Wrangu. We are a premier ServiceNow partner. I will begin with a brief little introduction about Wrangu, a little introduction about myself, go through the agenda, and then really dive into some of the obligations under the German law, just kind of get a high level view of some things to expect, who the law applies to, as well as, potentially an expanded scope EU-wide and how this will perhaps form a model for those later laws to come. So I will just dive in now. Yep, we are going to be again talking about understanding the German Due Diligence Act. And let me introduce you to Wrangu. Again, we are a premier ServiceNow partner, providing flexible software solutions for integrated risk, security, and privacy management. We were founded in 2016 with a mission to deliver software solutions that enable you to solve your risk and compliance challenges efficiently and with true transparency. We've delivered over 200 GRC, risk, security ops, and data privacy projects across 18 industries and 15 countries. Let me say a few words of introduction about myself. My name is Stephen Ragan. I am the principal privacy consultant at Wrangu, again, helping organizations understand regulations and overcome their compliance challenges. I'm a lawyer and also a fellow at the Center for Internet and Human Rights. So right now I want to pause for a moment and kind of draw this parallel about how we at Wrangu and how helping people comply with privacy and the GDPR has really given us that experience and that groundwork for dealing with some of these challenges under the German Due Diligence Act. There are actually quite a number of parallels, and also there's a similar hype surrounding the implementation of this law as it was when the GDPR was being first discussed and being first enacted. And so privacy, is really one of the most developed areas in responsible innovation because of this requirements and this expectation of compliance under the GDPR. It is also, in some sense, the most developed area for ESG, so that environmental, social, and governance business initiatives that companies are looking to implement. And let me just highlight some of these parallels between the GDPR and the Due Diligence Act. Of course, these European laws are being premised on a risk analysis and a risk assessment. And then there are similar obligations and requirements under these under the Due Diligence Act, like accountability and transparency, these principles that we see again from the GDPR being applied in a new context under this Due Diligence Act. So I just wanted to lay a bit of this, of course, this groundwork, these basic requirements of risk assessments, risk analysis in one space being applied in another area. So with that, I will just lay out some of lay out the agenda for today. So again, the focus of the discussion is going to be on the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, the Lieferkettengesetz in Germany, as well as a brief discussion about the EU directive and the expanded scope of similar laws throughout the EU. Again, look at some of the due diligence obligations under the German law, some of these challenges for organizations, as well as best practices for conducting due diligence. And again, leaving some time at the end for Q&A. As I've already mentioned at the beginning, we have a text box for Q&A and for chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will definitely be sure to get to them at the end. So the Lieferkettengesetz, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, the first question, of course, who is covered? Who does this apply to? This applies to all legal entities that are domiciled in Germany and meet an employee threshold. That is really the key consideration. So from January 1st, 2023, companies with 3,000 or more employees who are located in Germany will have to comply with the Due Diligence Act. That scope will expand to include companies with 1,000 or more employees a year later, January 1st, 2024. And there are a few key components that the law is focused on. So we have this bifurcation of human rights and environmental obligations. And I will go a bit more in depth into the definitions of both of these a little later on. But first I want to mention, so again, these components will also apply under the EU directive. They're both focused really on human rights and environmental obligations. But first I want to mention quickly a brief little discussion about what it means to be an employee under the law. So of course we have, the basic contractual relationship between companies and its, employees, for lack of a better word, I guess, this basic contractual relationship. You're an individual who does work for an organization or company, and then you are compensated for it. But of course is our basic understanding of what an employee is. But under the Due Diligence Act, we have a few more categorizations that also will count to this employee threshold. We have temporary workers employed for more than 6 months. These are also considered employees under the Act, as well as employees belonging to the same consolidated group. So take, for example, a parent company and its subsidiaries. The employees of those subsidiaries will roll up to count towards that employment number of the parent company, as well as all employees temporarily employed in other EU member states. So if you are a German employee, but you are currently working in Spain for a temporary period, nonetheless, you will still count towards that overall employment number. And again, the employee threshold is really that basic categorization or threshold for whether or not the law applies to you. So I want to, in brief, touch a bit on the EU directive, again, because I want to emphasize this, expanding scope and this focus, again, on due diligence obligations. So we see this kind of two-tracked approach for why organizations are going down this route. We of course we have the carrot or the stick, this metaphor. So of course the customers are willing in some sense to pay a premium for what they consider sustainable products. Investors are looking to put their money in what are called sustainable investments. Okay, so we have companies pivoting to these due diligence obligations because it's good for their business strategy. Now we have laws that are coming out that are now forcing organizations to go down this route. So more of the stick, less of the carrot. And the EU directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, the draft was actually published a little over a month ago on February 23rd, 2022. And again, with the idea to expand the scope, cover more companies. So under the directive, organizations and companies with more than 500 employees and revenues of 150 million worldwide, or 250 employees and a net turnover of more than 40 million euros, where 50% of that turnover is in a high-risk industry, which is like energy or manufacturing or automotives, then would also have to comply with due diligence obligations. I'm reiterating or recycling this word that the scope is is expanding, because under the directive, third country organizations would also have to comply with the law where they generate a significant amount of their business in the European Union. So again, we have this number of 150 million euros generated in the European Union, or 40 million, with 50% of that in high-risk industries. So not only do we have an expanded scope with the expectation of this new directive, but we also have, under the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, the German law, a requirement that an organization's suppliers, whether those are indirect and direct suppliers, will also have to, in some sense, comply with the law, because there are these obligations applied to companies regarding their suppliers and vendors and the use of their products and services and where those products and services come from. So it's not only organizations with 3,000 employees, or the expectation with the directive 500 employees or 250. Even companies in supply chains will have to also comply with the future legislation. And so I will posit that this EU directive is likely to be passed this year, 2022, but would not go into effect until 2024. And the European Commission estimates that the directive would then apply to 13,000 companies in the European Union and 4,000 non-EU companies. So we have certainly an incentive for organizations within Germany. Of course, they have to comply, but also organizations and companies outside of Germany should really be thinking about, if not to market themselves and brand themselves as an organization that cares about human rights and environmental risks. Well, okay, you are kind of going to have to, but if you do it right now, you have this period where you kind of innovate and gain those efficiencies and be a first mover, as we go forward. So I do want to mention quickly the difference between a regulation and a directive. So regulations in the European Union are essentially laws that are adopted by the European Parliament, European Commission, European Legislature, and those are then enacted essentially as they are into member state law. So take, for example, the GDPR, that is the General Data Protection Regulation. That law, for the most part, is the same from member state to member state. There are areas that are called derogations where the member states can, deviate and kind of do their own thing. Those are carve-outs that are within the law. One example of that is like whitelists and blacklists for data protection, impact assessments, for risk assessments. The whitelists are like processing areas where you have to conduct or you don't have to conduct a risk assessment, and blacklists where you do have to conduct a data protection impact assessment. Directives, on the other hand, lay out goals and obligations and principles that member states then have the ability to enact their laws to achieve those ends and goals. So again, Germany's will be their law going forward, even with the implementation of an EU directive, and will likely form the basis for future laws but from the other member states, of course, lowering this threshold to include companies with more than 500 employees, 250 employees, etc. So now let me turn to some of those obligations under the Lieferkettengesetz, the German Due Diligence Act. So there are actually 9 obligations under the law. I've just kind of combined and compressed some of them into 7 because I have this nice slide and I wanted it to all fit there. So the first obligation is accountability. So again, this is an idea that we can draw on from the GDPR. Under the GDPR, you have to be accountable, be able to demonstrate your compliance with the law. Under the Due Diligence Act, this accountability plays out in that organizations have to designate somebody within their company who is responsible for monitoring risk and compliance. So under the GDPR, we have data protection officers. This is more akin to something like a human rights officer. The second obligation comes from section 4 and 5. This is the requirement to set up a risk management system and conduct a risk analysis. So there is a wiggle room within the law about how you do this. It is just the, the requirement that you do implement a management system and analyze your risks, whether that's identifying, assessing, and prioritizing your risks, putting those in those quadrants of 3x3, low, medium, high, and then the likelihood of probability of violations of the human rights obligations or environmental risks. And all of these have to be reviewed on an annual basis. This is a recurrent theme within the Due Diligence Act, is that you have to put these mechanisms in place and then review them to improve on them. The third obligation is the administration of a policy statement. For the policy statement, preventive measures, documentation and reporting obligations, as well as remedial measures. I will go a bit further in depth in those in the coming slides. But I just want to highlight, we have the necessity for a policy statement. We have the necessity to implement preventive measures once you've identified those risks, to put mechanisms in place to prevent violations. Then we also have the requirement to put in a complaints procedure. This comes from Section 8. And this is, to create an avenue or an area where internal and external stakeholders can make complaints and bring those complaints to light of the company. They require an impartial review. And this, of course, is the basic idea that organizations and companies cannot remedy violations if they don't know about them. So one way to address this, again, is to have a complaints procedure in place. And this as well has to be reviewed on an annual basis. Then we have remedial measures. So you've done your risk analysis. You've put in place your preventive measures. Unfortunately, we get to this moment where there is nonetheless a violation of human rights or environmental obligations. Then immediate remedial action must be taken. And, this is of course, this is a concern for organizations, but there is a bit of a gray area about when organizations are required to act and when their responsibility is not so high. And this is termed a graded obligation. So the closer a company or an organization is to a violation, the greater responsibility to remedy the situation. So we have under the law, direct and indirect suppliers. Direct suppliers are those you have a contractual relationship with. You pay them money for some type of product or service. And in some sense, you have the capacity to dictate the terms of that relationship. And one of those can be contractual assurances from your direct suppliers that they adhere to, for example, a code of conduct. This is one way to remedy and prevent situations where your direct supplier violates human rights, whatever those might be. In some sense, you are right there. You have an obligation then to end that business relationship. For indirect suppliers, that relationship is a little more disconnected. You have less influence over their actions. So there is not the expectation that you do quite as much. I will touch a bit more on the graded obligations and remedial measures in a few slides as well, but I just want to mention before I turn to some of these obligations a bit more in depth, the documentation and reporting requirement from Section 10. This is that moment where organizations can tell what they've done, how they're addressing these obligations. And we see many companies already doing this with, for example, sustainability reports. So I will turn to preventive measures, go a little bit more, policy statement, and go just a bit more in depth on this. So this is really a concern with organizations implementing a business strategy and a policy statement that comes from the top down, really emphasizing this importance of these due diligence obligations throughout the organization, of course, starting with senior management who must adopt the policy statement. And the statement must contain the following elements of the human rights strategy: a description of the ways the due diligence obligations under the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act are fulfilled, as well as priority human rights and environmental risks identified by the risk analysis, and then human rights related and environmental related expectations, again, for employees and suppliers. Again, if you don't know in some sense how to act, if you aren't trained about what a human right violation is or the environmental obligations are, well, then in some sense you don't know what the right actions are to take. So all of this comes from the policy statement, and that is required under section 6.2. We're looking a bit more at what these preventive measures are. So you've done your risk analysis, you've assessed the risks. Okay, you want to put mechanisms in place to prevent violations. And some of those strategies, I've just laid them out here. The measures come from section 6, but there are a lot of things that organizations can do going beyond just what I've listed on these slides, but here, are just a few, and it's really concerned, of course, with looking at your supply chain, assessing your vendors, assessing your suppliers. You aren't starting from a clean slate. Often you already have relationships with these suppliers. So you can do some type of scoring and development of procurement strategies with them. Again, learning from those past behaviors to implement mechanisms for efficient means of dealing with these obligations. And then, of course, one of those is, those contractual assurances, as I've already mentioned. You have the development of your code of conduct for your employees. You can develop a code of conduct for your direct suppliers as well, and ensure that they adhere to them in your contractual statements. Now, I've mentioned as well the implementation and delivery of training, educating people about these due diligence obligations and how to behave in certain situations is another way to deal with some of these risks. And again, these preventive measures must be reviewed on an annual basis, learn from the past in order to go forward in the best way possible. Then we have remedial measures. As I've mentioned, what is this expectation of the action that organizations and companies have to take once they've discovered a violation has occurred or is imminent? The organization must take appropriate remedial action to prevent and or minimize the extent of the violation. Those measures must be taken in proportion to the nature and scope of your business activities, again, taking into account your ability to influence your suppliers and vendors. So again, the obligation, the expectation is related to how close those suppliers and vendors are to you in your business relationship and the degree of influence you can exercise over those companies. So for direct suppliers, remedial measures must generally put a stop to the violation of those human rights or environmental violations, or have to end that business relationship. For indirect suppliers, it is really sufficient to develop and implement a plan to stop or minimize violations. Other factors that have to be taken into account are the severity of the violations, the reversibility, and the probability of occurrence of human rights and environmental violations, as well as your company's causal contribution and the contribution of those direct and indirect suppliers. So those are the factors that you have to consider when implementing your remedial measures and these come from section 7 of the law. Finally, documentation and report generation. Again, this is really an opportunity in some sense for organizations to brand and market themselves, to tell their customers, to tell investors, to tell employees what you've been doing, that, in some sense that you really do care about human rights and environmental risks, as we all should. And, again, publish this in a sustainability report. This must be done once a year on your website and remain available free of charge for 7 years. The requirements come from section 10, but really, you must disclose the risks you identified and the steps taken to meet those obligations, what you've done to fulfill your obligations, how you assess the impact and effectiveness of your measures and what conclusions you can draw from your past assessments for future measures. With that, those are the basic due diligence obligations. I want to touch on just briefly, some of those definitions from Section 2. So what are human rights violations and what are your environmental obligations? So, human rights violations are aimed at preventing child labor, forced labor, slavery, unsafe working conditions, the denial of a living wage, preventing discrimination or displacement of people, preventing violence within the workplace. All these, basic things you would think, but they are all defined in Section 2 as well. And the Due Diligence Act also ties these human rights abuses connected with environmental damage as well. So, the effect on society of your business activities or your suppliers' activities. So whether that's, damage to soil, water pollution, air pollution, noise pollution, excessive water consumption, all of these are taken into account as violations of human rights. Again, has to be assessed, dealt with. The environmental obligations are also listed under Section 2, and they are tied to treaties and accords listed in the Act's Annex. So we have 3 treaties in particular: the Minamata Convention on Limiting Mercury Emissions, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste. All of these, again, are listed under Section 2, and are dealing with carbon emissions, measuring your greenhouse gas emissions, assessing how you are collecting, storing, and disposing of waste. Are you working with hazardous materials, prohibitions on using mercury products and compounds, as well as on other certain chemicals. So this requires a bit of a more in-depth understanding of those treaties and accords, as well as how you measure, your impact on the environment. So I mentioned a lot about the obligations, and there are a number of challenges, but it's another thing that I want to highlight about this experience of working with the GDPR and how we can apply it to this Due Diligence Act. So under the GDPR, we have to be able to track and map where our personal information is going, who is dealing with it, what they are doing with it. And it's very similar to mapping, creating transparency around your supply chain. And so we have transparency on the one hand and accountability as well. And mapping the supply chain is a really big challenge that I've seen with a lot of customers and clients. And so I just want to lay it out a bit to give you a little understanding of some of those areas that you have to deal with. So that first stage again is assessing your suppliers, prioritizing your high-risk vendors, your high-risk suppliers. And you can do this through an assessment or a questionnaire, or past experiences as well. And then you prioritize your risks, and do you have to go and do an audit of the facility? Do you have to see how things are really in practice? And of course, you can't do that for all of your suppliers, and in some sense, maybe you can't do them for any of your suppliers. It's really resource intensive, but you have to be able to prioritize and give scores to your vendors and suppliers, those high risk ones. Maybe you don't work with those high risk suppliers in the future. Maybe you find alternative sources for your products and services. So from that assessment, then we look at your suppliers. So what are the parts and services being provided? How are they being provided? What are the working conditions? Again, all of these, are employees being paid a living wage? Do they have safe working conditions? All of these necessary pieces of information that you need to choose your suppliers, to choose your vendors in a manner that complies with the law. Then we have the assembly of the products. Do we meet your quality criteria? You put the products together, put your goods and services together, and then you ship them out, you give them to vendors, and they sell them, they do whatever they want with them. But that is actually not the end of the story, because you have to think about how are your products and services being used? Are they having detrimental? Are they violating customers' human rights or environmental obligations? I mean, what your business is providing, what services, what products they're providing, but how are they being used? Yes, of course, I'm just reiterating myself now, but it is, the final piece of that puzzle that you have to assess, your supply chain, but also your entire value chain. And so we have different definitions. I've kind of already laid them out for direct suppliers and indirect suppliers. There are cases, of course, where a supplier can be both of them. So maybe you provide the tires for an automotive product, and you provide the rubber that goes into the matting that somebody else is making. Okay, so you're both a direct and an indirect supplier, but nonetheless, you have that contractual relationship in the example that I just gave. For your company, higher obligation for dealing with violations of your obligations. So of course, perhaps the last question is enforcement. Who is tasked with enforcing the law, and what are their enforcement powers? What are those fines, sanctions, and investigations? How are they really putting the stick to you, so to say? And the supervisory authority is the Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control. They are responsible for monitoring and enforcement. They can investigate on their own initiative or at the request of an affected person. In addition, trade unions and NGOs can be granted authority to conduct litigation on behalf of affected parties. So that individuals, in some sense, might not have the resources to bring these types of actions. Okay, well, there are designated institutions that can do that on behalf of affected individuals. And fines for violations of your obligations. This is kind of the big question. And then companies with an average annual turnover of more than 400 million euros may be fined up to 2% of their average annual turnover for breaches. Other fines and violations can go up to 8 million euros. Otherwise, we have fines of around 800,000 euros. For violations of the obligations, you are also then excluded from government contracts for up to 3 years. So with that, I just want to lay out some final thoughts on the challenges and potential solutions, some questions to keep in mind, kind of guide your thinking around this law, what needs to be done, who within the organization is responsible, what metrics can we create around compliance, how do we manage our risk and our risk, as well as the risks of our suppliers and vendors, and how do we vet and monitor our suppliers. And of course, some solutions, visualizing that supply chain, getting transparency, developing and sending out risk analysis questionnaires, identifying your supplier scores, compliance as a KPI, and then ultimately, using ESG to establish a wider business strategy. And so, I was just really concerned with getting a high-level overview of the law. If you want to learn a bit more about a potential product solution from Wrangu, we are going to do a webinar with ServiceNow in German on April 12th at 2 p.m. Central European time. And with that, I will maybe take a drink of water and pause for some questions. So there is definitely a recurrent question that I'm getting a lot from customers and clients, and that is again related to this expectation of what organizations have to do and when they have to act, and what are those actions they have to take. And as I've mentioned, we have these graded obligations. We have direct and indirect suppliers, where you have a higher level of influence on suppliers then there is a higher expectation for the actions that you have to take. And that does include, in some sense, potentially ending the business relationship. That is definitely not the initial go-to. You want to put in, steps or mechanisms in place to try to address and deal with those violations, before you do end that business relationship. Then a second question, I often get is related to the UK. Of course, I've mentioned the EU directive. I've been talking about a due diligence act within Germany, but what about the UK? And there is an act aligned to environmental obligations, actually called the Environment Act, which is under consideration, and the public consultation period for that actually ended on March 11th, so just over 2 weeks ago. So there is definitely wider movement in Europe as a whole, in the UK. And I will also mention that the United States, the SEC, has also put forward sustainable reporting requirements that will potentially go into effect and as part of the wider agenda of the Biden administration. Somebody has asked if we will get the presentation afterwards. I do think that we will make this available and send out the slides. And then there is a question: will there be a European next to a German law? I'm not exactly sure what this question is asking. I will say again that there is the EU directive that is under proposal at the moment, on due diligence obligations. There are also already existing laws in some member states related to this. The German one has just generated a lot of hype at the moment for the breadth and the scope of it. But these due diligence laws also will, in some sense, act in accord with other existing EU laws. So we have the taxonomy regulation kind of laying out very extensively in the obligations related to the environment. And then we have corporate sustainability reporting requirements as well. And that will then coincide with these due diligence obligations for the EU directive. So all of these laws kind of working together, coinciding, trying to bolster human rights on the one hand, but also making the EU's initiative towards those commitments, and for example the Paris Climate Accord, manifesting those in an attempt to limit the warming of the planet. And so we see these, kind of tying together, and then at the same time, there's a big net zero movement and attempts to create a more sustainable cyclical economy. So we all see this all kind of coming to a head at the moment. Very high priority for organizations. Again, on the one hand, the stick or the carrot. Lots of companies already implementing sustainable practices, ESG initiatives, and so. If you don't want to do it, well, you kind of now have to do it. So again, if you want to learn more about that, and you are a German speaker, if you are in Germany, we will have a webinar again on April 12th, and I hope to see you all there, and this will be in conjunction with ServiceNow. And with that, I want to thank you all for attending. Thank you for the questions, and I hope you have a good rest of your Thursday, a nice Friday, and then a good weekend going forward. So thank you all again, and have a good day. Bye.